So I'd like to resume what I said before, my dear colleagues. I greet you all before. I said that I'm Wilder Tyler. I come from the National Institution for Human Rights in Uruguay. I'm together with you because Mr. Amadiop of the committee had to moderate this panel, but he wasn't able to come. So I'll replace him. And on behalf of him, let me tell you that we do have organized this panel because during the regional consultations, the way mechanisms were connected amongst the United Nations, together with the different stakeholders of civil society, something that was said that was vital to us. It was very important to share the experiences as well as the challenges that are related with cooperation and the work that we do. In this panel, we are going to deal with several goals: how to put together victims and civil society members with mechanisms of the United Nations, how to boost and also to communicate about the reports that we prepare and to present in front of the organizations of the United Nations, as well as the role that family organizations are playing to present the best practices in front of the United Nations. So this is kind of a very interesting topic. Let me tell you, this is vital to us. We do have an amazing and a very powerful panel with a lot of expertise and know-how. And we have a very bad news because we don't have too much time. I'm really sorry. So, well, I kindly ask you to bear with me. Please be tolerant. And I'm going to be very, very strict when dealing with the times that have been given for you. And I hope that I won't need to recall the protocols and how we discuss related with pluralism and exchanges, okay? Having said this, let me tell you that this panel is kind of a complicated panel. It's going to be split in two different moments all along this afternoon. We do have a first panel together with colleagues coming from the committee, the four disparitions, together with Juan Pablo Alencastro and Alban Profet Palasco. And we do have other colleagues that belong to the working group. We do have Ana Lorena Delgadillo Perez and Gabriela Uma. Originally, it was a committee to speak, but due to historical reasons and for us to get the sense and also to better understand the evolution of mechanisms, we are going to deal, first of all, with the group of work. I'd like to give the floor. You had 10 minutes, now you have 8 minutes, each of you, 8 minutes. So please, if you can do it in 5, much better. I deeply thank you. But let me tell you once the time is over. Daniela? Yes, 5 minutes each and every one of you.
Thank you, Wilder.
So 2 minutes and a half.
Today is provide a very brief overview of the mandate of the working group, Ana Lorena and myself, both the humanitarian mandate of the working group and also the monitoring mandate. And we want to focus on the ways in which you as civil society organizations, human rights defenders, victims can engage with the working group, not only in terms of the individual cases of forced disappearances, but also in terms of other situations of concerns or contextual situation in which the intervention of the working group might be of value. So the working group is mandated to oversee the implementation of the Declaration on Forced Disappearances, and that is the core of its mandate, of its monitoring mandate. But of course, the work is also very much guided by the provisions of that convention. And the working group is a very fierce advocate of the ratification of the convention. And I think what's really interesting is that the working group, even though the original mandate was a humanitarian one to focus on the individual cases of enforced disappearances is also part of the special procedures mechanisms. It's also a mechanism that shares with other special rapporteurs, with other working groups, the activities, the interventions that the special procedures can undertake. So there are also a wealth of opportunities for engagement with the working group beyond the individual cases. And Ana Lorena will speak a little bit more about this monitoring mandate and the ways that you can intervene with the working group, engage with the working group. But then in terms of the humanitarian mandate, which was the original mandate of the working group when it was created in 1980, the working group, as you know, tries to act as a channel of communication between the sources of cases, whether these cases are brought to the attention of the working group by the victims themselves, the families, or NGOs representing them, and the relevant state. And the exchange of information has the ultimate objective, of course, of learning the fate and whereabouts of the disappeared person. So the working group intervenes by transmitting cases either under its urgent procedure when the disappearance took place recently, or through the standard procedure, which are the cases that are reviewed during the sessions of the working group. The working group meets 3 times a year. And what fuels these interactions, what fuels these interventions is, of course, information received from the sources. So as NGOs, as human rights defenders, you are invited to provide the working group with as much information as possible about the cases to keep this communication between the state and the sources as active as possible. The cases remain well, are not clarified until enough information is received on the fate and whereabouts of the disappeared persons. These are treated individually. If the state provides information that could lead to the clarification of the case, then the working group shares this information with the source. And we have something called the 6-month rule, which is a 6-month period that the source has to analyze the information provided by the government and decide if it really does provide information to resolve the case, to clarify the case, or to contest that information. And if 6 months elapse and there is no reply from the source, then the case is finally clarified. But again, a clarification of a case under the humanitarian procedure does not mean, of course, that under the monitoring mandate, which is the human rights mandate of the working group, there might be still issues of concern in terms of the human rights violations that occurred during the enforced disappearance or related to that specific enforced disappearance. So in a nutshell, that is the humanitarian mandate, and I will let Ana Lorena speak a lot more about the monitoring mandate and the avenues to engage with the working group.
Sí, muchísimas gracias. Parece que estamos como corriendo, ¿verdad? Pero bueno.
Oh, I'm so sorry because we are kind of speeding up. I'd just like to add on something. When we talk about the humanitarian mandate, let me tell you something that's new to many of us. When several countries are in a specific case, the working group sends a communication to multiple countries, all the countries that are at stake. Depending on the subject, we send communications to the World Bank because there is something related with the forced disappearance of someone, something that we cannot see in other kind of mechanisms. Also, as part of the surveillance mandate, as you know, the working group has to double-check the implementation of the protection of people against forced disappearances. We do have 3 main sessions, 2 in Geneva and another one in a guest country. This is very interesting to us. We do have the opportunity to get closer to victims' reality. As an example, last year, we do have a meeting in Poland, and we were able to have access to 200 women. We must tell that the majority of people were women. These appeared people from Ukraine. They were women. This is very helpful. Being in the field really allows us to seize the reality of things. We do have visits in different countries. We do have interviews with all the authorities, with the victims, with the organizations. We do visit interesting places for the specific cases. And during the country visits, we do publish a report with a series of recommendations for the countries. Let me tell you that we are less invited right now to the countries. Something important that we must know what civil society can do. Can we make some pressure for the country to accept a visit of the working group? What is happening nowadays? We are suffering a very deep financial crisis in the United Nations, as you are aware. And this year we had a lot of visits to do, and we didn't have enough funds to make this happen. Beyond the country visit, we do have other kind of communications as well. We do have communications and global allegations. They must be passed and approved during our sessions. We do study specifically concrete case of a country if it's complying or not with the declaration for people's protection when dealing with forced disparitions. We do see the systematic issues that happen in a country. How can you get a connection with this regard? You can send a very simple document. It has not to do like a treaty, not more than 5, 6, 7 pages. You can tell us what is happening, offer us a diagnosis, what do you recommend us to take into account. And finally, we also have the joint allegations that can be sent between sessions. There was an issue when dealing with urgent topics. We can invite other special proceedings of the United Nations to intervene as well. Thank you very much for respecting the time. Juan Pablo and Abba, you have the floor, 6 minutes.
Good afternoon to all of you. Thanks very much for being here. The Committee on Enforced Disappearances is in charge, as you know, to supervise the implementation of the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons Against Enforced Disappearances, which is one of the last treaties that was adopted and which benefits from the experience of previous treaty bodies. This means that the Convention has a fantastic legal framework providing lots of tools and opportunities to prevent and eradicate enforced disappearances. But now the role of all of us is interrelated and has to be coordinated and strengthened. That this coordination has to be strengthened so that all these instruments can be indeed implemented. So we have 6 procedures: reporting procedure, urgent actions, individual communications, interstate complaints, country visits, and raise the matters to the DA, General Assembly. Very shortly, as we have 1 minute per procedure, the reporting procedure is compulsory for all states parties. They have to report after 2 years after having ratified the convention. And after, contrary to the other treaty bodies, the committee doesn't have a system of periodic reports, but can ask the state to provide additional information on specific issues. I'm not going to enter into the details, but of course, in all these settings, the interventions, the contributions of civil society, of victims, are key and essential for the committee to carry out its work. Then we have the urgent actions, which is very similar to the urgent action procedure of the working group. What is important here is to clarify who is doing what. We have the working group that has a worldwide competence, and the committee that only has a competence for states that have ratified the convention. And this generates lots of confusion very often. And we have always to insist on that. And we all invite you to raise awareness on this issue. It's not a question of saying, okay, we're not interested in that country. It's because simply some states have not ratified, so the committee has no competence to intervene. And then we intervene in a complementary manner with the working group. We pass the cases. When the working group receives a case which is of the competence of the committee, it's transmitted to the committee and vice versa. And this coordination is an ongoing process. The procedure, the only difference that we have is that in the follow-up, the committee enters into very specific recommendations regarding the implementation of the convention for each and every cases. And it's absolutely essential that the authors of the urgent action requests that are always maintained confidential are providing information so that we do the work together. We are here to work together. I pass the floor to Juan Pablo.
Bien, buenas tardes. Voy a ser también muy breve.
Good afternoon. I'm going to try to be very brief. We don't have too much time. I'd like to complete Alban explanations. Also, the Commission gives us the mandate to have individual commissions. Differently with the urgent action processes, the individual communications can only be sent by the states that have ratified the competence of the committee to recognize. Unfortunately, are not all the states that ratified the convention. It is important to mention that the process aims to declare the national responsibility of the specific states, relying on the specific ideas of the convention. Urgent action doesn't look to have an international promotion. It's aiming at protecting individuals, to promote activities for research. The individual communication all wants to see an individual response and also to get the reparation in favor of victims, always from the optics of the committee. It is important to underscore that Article 31 that regulates individual communication foresees the possibility that a committee at any time to make some cautious measures to protect the individuals, aiming at protecting the individuals. Also, the Commission allows us to see the interstate communications. It is important to underscore that despite today there are very few states that recognize the competence of the committee didn't get any interstate communication. We did get individual communications and we solved 5 cases, but we didn't get any kind of interstate communications. Not yet. Obviously, there is a kind of rejection for one state to be plaintiff against another state. It is different if the issue had not to do with human rights protection, right? But on the other hand, it is important to mention that the convention is one of the few instruments that we have inside the whole body of human rights treaties in the UN that allows the different organizations to have state visits. The visits are made once we have faithful information about very grave violations. We did 3 visits. The first one was in Mexico, November 2022. The second one, 2023 in Iraq, and the last one, very few weeks ago, we went to Colombia. Inside the visit framework, we tried to see the implementation of the treaty in the field, how to create new recommendations for the state to comply with the obligations inside the context of the convention. Finally, the treaty allows the possibility to something that really Alban is telling me there are 2 visits that were already accepted by the states because we also need the acceptance of the state, and Burkina Faso and Honduras, they accepted to have the visit. However, we do not know when this is happening due to the volume of work that the committee has, mainly the secretary that is doing a huge effort, but secondly, due to the budgetary limitations that the UN system always suffers. And finally, to conclude my presentation, Article 34 of the Convention includes a mandate that was not activated, but it's a very relevant one. Once we determine and define the information, the visits, the different cases, that we can see that there is a systematic practice of these operations in a part of the state, the committee can bring the issue to the political bodies, mainly to the General Assembly of the United Nations, for the political bodies to take decisions about how the state should act and what can we recommend to the state. That's all from my side because time flies. Thank you very, very much. Juan Pablo, I think that we did it. Well, let's try to be very practical. I can see a full house room. Please, if you want to intervene, you can speak from your seats, and the next participants to speak from your seats. The next participants are Jean-Jacques NGANYA. I don't know if you can find, is he here? And Yelyzaveta SOKURENKO, is it here? Okay, thank you for your presence and welcome. And Mr. Alexis THIRY from legalization of MENA rights. Are you there? Okay, I should have told that Ms. Zapulenko comes from the Center for Human Rights, and she is the manager for documentation of war crimes in Ukraine. So, in this regard, I'd like to ask her, on the basis of a series of questions that we have, can you talk about your experience? And what's the relationship that you have with the UN mechanisms? We'd like to know what are the mechanisms you are dealing with. How do you work? How do you give support to families? When you bring the information to the table for the mechanisms? And also, can you give us some examples? What are the results that you achieved up to date? And also the flaws and the pitfalls. And finally, a series of recommendations. Please, I kindly ask you to speak just for 3 minutes. We can start right now.
I will try to speak just for 3 minutes, but I think it won't work. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to share our experience as well as challenges in engaging with the UN mechanisms. So for the last 2 years, we prepared about 20 submissions to both treaty-based and charter-based UN bodies. Mostly in those submissions, we provided information about Russia's gross violations against civilians in the occupied territory of Ukraine during the full-scale invasion, such as arbitrary detentions, enforced disappearances, extrajudicial executions, sexual violence, torture, and inhumane treatment. We, of course, also work on submissions regarding the situation with the human rights in Ukraine. Last summer, for example, we, together with our partners, prepared an overview regarding Ukraine's ability to ensure compliance with international law standards for the protection of victims of enforced disappearances to the UN Committee on Enforced Disappearances due to its review on Ukraine. But as it's written, I'm the head of War Crimes Documentation Department, so everything we'll talk about will relate to our engagement with the UN bodies regarding international crimes committed by Russia. So I would say that our first experience of such engagement was quite successful in 2023, together with our colleagues from the Initiative for Human Rights. It's also a Ukrainian non-governmental organization, and the World Organization Against Torture. We submitted information to the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Alice Jill Edwards, about the systematic torture of Ukrainian civilians in those territories that are controlled by Russia, the Russian military, as well as a joint report on torture and enforced disappearances to the Universal Periodic Review for Russia. And after that, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture sent a letter to Russia, stating that the widespread use of torture by the Russian military appears to be deliberated, and that the cases, the documented cases, demonstrate state-sanctioned torture and crimes against humanity. Despite the fact that Russia is ignoring its international obligations, the lack of response to this letter is still the result. So we're lucky enough to have such partners as MCT that guided us during this process, but I want to highlight that the capacity building for the Ukrainian NGOs of how to engage with the UN mechanisms and understanding of their mandates is crucial. So recently, the Kharkiv Institute on Social Studies conducted research on the population's attitude towards international crimes in Ukraine, and the results shows that respondents consider international and national organization to be the most effective in investigating war crimes and accordingly the most trusted. I want to point out here that we do cooperate with the UN monitoring mission and the International Commission of Inquiry on lots of times. So we do appreciate their work a lot, and it's very important what they do and their reports in order to hold Russia accountable for its crimes. So, well, as I was said, we have quite challenges expectations, both international and Ukrainian human rights organizations from survivors but at the same time, it places an obligation on us to ensure that victims have access to such mechanisms, as well as to provide them with full and understandable information about how they function. So this is important in order to ensure that the expectations of victims are met with the capabilities of such mechanisms. Last autumn, within the framework of Global Initiative Against Impunity, we had an opportunity to join the work on the guide, how victims in Ukraine can be heard by the International Criminal Court. So this guide was created to help Ukrainians understand the mechanism of the ICC and the opportunities of victims to testify and participate in trials. And I think this experience can also be applied to the UN mechanisms. So in some cases, we also address UN mechanisms concerning specific people who are illegally detained, have critical health conditions, and they're in urgent need of medical care, for example. And the following reaction helps us to draw attention to these cases. And in some, at least to improve the conditions of detention of political prisoners and civilians that were illegally deprived of liberty by Russia. However, such experience is rather challenging, and some of our submissions, even those for which we received a request for, remain unanswered. So it's important to understand that each time we have to contact the families of the victims to obtain consent. So when there is no response from, for example, special procedures, it once again causes sufferings to the relatives who place their hopes on us. So in addition, those relatives with whom we're in contact and who are able to independently address, for example, the working groups, they also often do not receive any responses or any kind of feedback, so which also increases their feeling of hopelessness. I think the answer to this situation is quite obvious, and it was already mentioned, the lack of resources, considering the number of requests that experts receive from all over the world. Therefore, I think it's important to find the ways to ensure full and comprehensive support for UN mechanisms, and as well as adopt the changes regarding nowadays challenges that appear among them. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, colega. Entonces ahora.
Thank you so much. So now we will hear from Alexis THIRY, legal advisor of MENA Rights, and you have 5 minutes, Alexis.
Merci beaucoup, bonjour à tous et à toutes. Donc par rapport justement au mécanisme que l'organisation pour laquelle je travaille, MENA Rights Group, utilise, peut-être quelques mots sur MRG, MENA Rights Group. Donc on travaille sur la région Moyen-Orient, Afrique
I
du
will
Nord.
ask you to continue,
On travaille énormément avec
and
les mécanismes
then we can
des Nations
add a
Unies,
minute to your
notamment
intervention.
justement le comité des disparitions forcées et
As I
le groupe
was
de
saying,
travail.
in the framework
Donc
of
la
our
plupart des cas
work
que nous soumettons qui
with
justement sont liés à des
enforced
actes de disparition
disappearances,
forcée
mainly with Iraq, which is part of the
ont été
convention
commis
since
dans le contexte
2010.
justement de la guerre contre
most
l'État islamique en Irak.
cases, there's
Mais
been
aussi
detained people
à
in this
partir de
context, but
2019,
unfortunately, we've
on a vu
also
aussi une
seen that
augmentation
since 2019, there's been an
des
increase
cas de
in
disparition
kidnapping
forcée
of
dans le cadre, je crois
protesters
que l'interprétation peut-être.
precisely in this movement
Je vous ai pas
in
entendu
the
aussi.
countries and contexts where countries have not signed the convention. As Alvana was explaining before, we go to the work group.
Je vais continuer.
This is the individual work that is done, and I also want to add that individually we also work with the Human Rights Committee. We have presented the case of a person disappeared during the Algeria war, and for enforced disappearances, as you know, brings along many different complex issues, and it affects prohibition of torture, right to life, and many other things, and it is a way of calling upon many vulnerations of the International Pact. Structurally speaking, we are also having a UN mechanism interaction with the bodies of treaties, presenting alternative reports shortly before the review of the corresponding body. We've done it with Mauritania and Morocco with the CED, and that was the occasion so that people involved and relatives of enforced disappeared could come and present their witness to experts in the UN. How do we do this work with the families of victims? Individually, well, we always start with obtaining consent. This is the starting point, the true starting point of the work. And then, of course, we need to document the case. We have questionnaires that allow us to obtain all the information, identity of the disappeared person, date and time of the disappearance, and parties involved, and all the different steps taken to find the person. And based on that, we can determine what mechanism to send it to. We also have reprisals, which is also thought about, and also managing expectations. It's not a guarantee of freedom, so we need to be clear regarding the retaliations, and then some works are done with the UN mechanisms. The family needs to be informed. Albano explains this entire process of Q&A with the state, which is also very important. It's important to do this follow-up with the relatives of the victims, to work with the UN mechanisms. And committees brings along many different challenges. It is true that our work may be complicated as far as the measurement of the compliance and successes. Of course, there's many challenges, and I'm going to insist on this, but we have managed to get some results, especially in the short-term disappearances cases in which we've worked in Iraq precisely. Some people have been released, not just because of the intervention of a committee, but this is also part of all the different stakeholders who are part of the release or freedom. Another part is the obtention of information of the charges against the person I've mentioned. The mechanism in the Human Rights Committee, we've presented a case regarding a disappearance. There's around 30-40 cases in the committee related to violations committed during the civil war, but none has been recognized by the state. And therefore, the follow-up or monitoring committee has been suspended. I need to finish now, but this was very important. I had to talk about the situation in Syria, precisely relating to the difficulties for civil society, and perhaps provide some tips for recommendations, and I will close with that. Just one more minute. It is very important in this context that the UN mechanisms become aware of the challenges the different stakeholders on the field face. There's many fake or false prisons that are discovered, and this is a result of the information collection. We have visited a colleague on site who has sent us a lot of information. It is important for the walls on which prisoners have written need to be preserved, and everything around a prison needs to be standing in order to provide proper witness. And the UN mechanisms, the work group, and the security mechanisms created in the Syrian context can go there and on site to provide help to people on the field. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so we've heard from colleagues from Ukraine and Middle East, North of Africa as well, talking about the mechanisms with which they work, how they support the families, and what are the challenges they find and the recommendations they have to put forward. Now, we are going to talk about some of the mechanisms, those related to enforced disappearances, but not just that. Colleagues from the Human Rights Committee and the mechanism on these extrajudicial executions, to react to these comments and to bring in their ideas. We have Juan Pablo Alban and Ana Lorena here. I don't know whether the other colleagues, Professor Chigurda and Maurice Tidbal, are you comfortable speaking from there, or would you wish, Maurice says he is comfortable, and Professor is, well, fine. So in that case, I will ask Juan Pablo Alban Alancastro, an expert on enforced disappearances, on the Committee on Enforced Disappearances, to provide his first reaction to this in 5 minutes, please. Well, obviously, the information collected on the field is of utmost essence for us in order to comply with the mandates on the activities carried out by the committee in virtue of the convention. But of course, we also understand the limitations and difficulties that the use of the mechanisms entails, starting with the lack of knowledge. We know and understand that beyond the goodwill of organizations that work on the field, there's not necessarily dissemination work that is done sufficiently, and perhaps the UN should invest much more in this, not just financially, but also time and capacities as well as skills in dissemination work. We also understand that not all the information that we receive from diverse civil society organizations working in different areas in the world is going to be as consistent or be supported with the same type of evidence, because, as was said before, there's huge difficulties to be able to bring evidence on the field based on what is happening now in the Ukrainian context, considering that, yes, this is happening in the territory of Ukraine, but disappearances are not necessarily perpetrated by the Ukrainian state. There's another state invading the territory, so it's very difficult to collect information. Same thing happens in other contexts, despite there's no existence of armed conflicts. It's important to mention as well that, of course, and indeed, the first reaction of the committee and the work group as well, because we're doing this jointly, we are constantly trying to identify new trends or problems in this context of enforced disappearances. A good example of this effort is the recent joint declaration that was adopted. We also tried to have the Committee on Human Rights embarking on this, and we brought it along or brought it out with the work group, but we spoke about the ill-called short-term disappearances. Let's please not use this term any longer, because a disappearance is a disappearance regardless of its duration. As long as we have the 3 elements of a disappearance, it is a disappearance. So that's what we do. Recently, there's been new reports on the use of technology by the work group in search processes and how technology can have an influence in the resolution of enforced disappearance cases. Now the committee is working on a general comments project on women and enforced disappearances, and recently they published the first general comment on migration or enforced disappearances in migration routes. And we do try to diversify, and we understand that these are tools that will be useful for CSOs, but we also understand that not everything we do is sufficient or suitable. Sometimes it takes a long time, and we need to acknowledge that there's serious difficulties given the response times. This is related to the lack of sufficient resources. Our secretariat is just tiny. We don't have the capacity, and we need to applaud the work done by the secretariat to actually meet all the work that we have, and we recognize even more the complexities of implementation internally. This is something that was mentioned in the previous comments, and this is just a first reaction. I don't want to speak of the time I have. Thank you very much. I would propose a combination of mandates, perhaps. So Professor Tiguta, I don't know whether you're ready and she would like to speak now. 5 minutes. Then she's professor member of the UN Human Rights Committee. So we're speaking about this, and she's very related to the violation of human rights that we're seeing now.
Suficiente ni oportuno. A veces nos toma mucho tiempo y hay que reconocer que hay
Thank you very
dificultades serias
much.
por los tiempos de respuesta.
I
Esto
would
tiene que
like
ver
to talk
con
about
la falta de
several
recursos
things that have been
suficientes.
said
Nuestra secretaría es
today and this morning.
Realmente no tenemos una
Well, the
capacidad,
Human
hay que
Rights
reconocer y
Committee
aplaudir el
is the
esfuerzo que nuestra
surveillance
secretaría hace para cumplir con el trabajo que
committee that does not
y
speak about
obviamente
enforced
reconocemos
disappearances, but
todavía más
as
las complejidades de
Alexis said, now it
implementación a
is
nivel
obvious that enforced
interno, que es algo
disappearances
que
is
se
a
mencionaba
violation
en
of
una
almost
de las
all rights
intervenciones.
found
Hasta aquí,
in
para no excederme del tiempo, una primera reacción.
civil treaties, physical
Muchísimas gracias.
right to access truth and justice. It is clear that very quickly in practice and case studies, all practices linked to this complex crime, as Alexis said, this falls upon the UN Human Rights Committee. It is true that we do not have experience or such a good experience in the Committee on Enforced Disappearances or the work group of enforced and involuntary disappearances. Of course, we don't have the experience they have, but the Human Rights Committee has its added value and works on enforced disappearances as well, and I would like to mention some. Firstly, the deal on civil rights signed by 174 member states. This is not a universal ratification, but we're close. And the protocol that allows for individual communications is ratified by 160 states. This means that we can make 116 responsible, and in those territories we would find enforced disappearances, or they would be responsible of enforced disappearances. So how is the Human Rights Committee intervening? I will mention specifically 2 different elements and a half. First, I would like to say that the committee has built after the 80s and 90s a case study based on individual cases on the basis of the individual claims brought along by the relatives of the victims. This case law has evolved and is now consolidated in cases related to enforced disappearances in Nepal, Algeria, as Alexis mentioned, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Colombia, Chile, and in Mexico as well. It is obvious that when we take a claim to the Human Rights Committee, as Juan Pablo just said, with the Committee on Enforced Disappearances, we are in a long term here. We do not have the humanitarian emergency mandate, and sometimes here for the families and relatives of the victims, and I'm aware of this, there is a frustration element because this is a mechanism that aims at searching or finding responsibilities in a state, and we are in an almost legal process, and of course this will necessarily take a few years. I would like to hear what civil society believes and thinks, but when you have to tell the families of victims that a body or a committee takes 4, 5, 6 years in replying a complaint, that can be a re-victimization element for the families of the victims. I'm aware of this. What is interesting in these contentious actions, and I remember a conversation I held with Juan Carlos, he will speak later, about Mexico. When we started with the Human Rights Committee receiving the first complaints regarding enforced disappearances in Mexico, I asked Juan Carlos why he was coming to the Human Rights Committee when there were regional mechanisms such as the Inter-American Court. And Juan Carlos said, and I like that a lot, we do not want for this matter of disappearances to be left at a regional level and to be a Latin American problem. the UN would not be aware of that. And I believe this explains why the first cases were taken to the Human Rights Committee. In this contentious action, sometimes, and this is based on voluntary action, done voluntarily, of course, there is a pre-contentious action. And in this case, and lately, this is done a lot in enforced disappearances in Ukraine, Russia. As rapporteur, I sometimes receive reports that do not comply with the correct legal categories, and what we try to do is to have informal meetings with civil society so that the complaints and claims presented before the Human Rights Committee are in the correct legal classification. This is the first action. The second action, and it's similar to what the committee does, is the periodic review of states. The 174 states are examined periodically by the Human Rights Committee, and we use what the CED and the work group do a lot. In the conversations that we hold with states, we use the report, or we take on, and the same thing happens with the special rapporteurs, we take on your communications and we ask the state why they have not replied to the communications sent by such and such special rapporteur or such and such work group. And in the final observations, we can also prepare very specific recommendations on the legislation when it's found to not be enough, on institutional mechanisms, on the search of victims, on investigations when they do not move forward or are not of high enough quality. And very frequently, we either recommend the ratification of the convention. The HR committee is also a body that does campaigning for the CED, and sometimes in our recommendations we ask states to allow or authorize visits either by the work group or the special informers or rapporteurs. We've had this conversation with Venezuela, Mexico, Russia, Syria, Turkey, amongst others. And finally, and I will be very fast with this, I've gone over my time, follow-up. Alexis was talking about this is the weak spot of the Human Rights Committee, but I believe that same thing happens with other committees. We do not have in the mandate the possibility of doing on-site visits as the CED does, and we have a follow-up committee, a monitoring committee on paper. We send notes to the states when they do not comply with recommendations, and as has been said before, we stop the conversation when we see that the state is not responding. This is our weak spot that we try to offset with more informal missions prepared generally with an NGO, this GPSCR Center. I want to thank them, and in these cases we deal with all the matters, we get in touch with the families of victims, etc., etc. And I'll stop here. Moderators cannot have an opinion, but you know that as a person from Uruguay, I always take into account the impressive role of the Human Rights Committee and how thankful we are regarding enforced disappearances and the attorneys of the time, of course. I know this came before the committee, but it was so important for us all. So allow me to do that. Yes, and now I'm going to ask our colleague Ana Lorena to react again in just 5 minutes, please. Well, I will firstly like to say that we are very aware, Yelyzaveta, of how difficult it is to document and take the cases whenever there is an armed conflict or a war. These are the most difficult situations to document cases and to provide follow-up. The working group has conveyed 2,300 cases to the Russian Federation on disappearances, but what we need to say is that so far, that's where we receive the most cases worldwide. It's impressive the amount of cases that we get. We have a delay of over 6,000 cases that we're still processing. We have been communicating this to families because they've been telling us that they don't receive immediate responses, and we know what this means for a family that gets to us as a last resort and they don't get a final response or an immediate response. But this is also because of the lack of internal resources that we have in the working group. We have one single person processing all the different Ukraine cases and also other regions. So we need to take into account one thing that we should take into account in the UN. How can we face these emerging situations where the number of cases exceed by far the capacity a group has? We should think about these situations and context differently, and this is some food for thought, you know. And also, the thing with states is very important. Sometimes families come and say, we don't get a response by the states. And we need to take into account here that the work group will give an answer to the families if we get a response by the states. At first, we got responses by the Russian Federation, but currently there's no more responses. This happens with Russia, but also with other countries as well. And it is very important to note that whenever there's a rise of authoritarianism, there's a reduction of the capacity of the UN bodies to have an influence, and there's a reduction or disappearance of conversation. It is impossible to communicate with them. It has happened to me that, well, when we come to Geneva, we all talk with permanent missions to be aware of what's happening, and it doesn't really bring an outcome. Sometimes not even meetings bring an outcome. So we act within the framework we have, and we try to do as much as possible. Gabriela will now fill in my contribution. We find other ways as well, like allegations, joint allegations, or press notes to call attention upon what's happening. And as the MENA colleague was saying, I totally agree. Yes, this is also linked to authoritarian states. Now, one of the things that we're seeing is how enforced disappearances are affecting the civil space. There's more and more limitations in the use of civil space, and enforced disappearances are used more and more as a tool to limit. So here, we are going into what Juan Pablo mentioned, the ill-called short-term enforced disappearances, because we have many difficulties there. We have difficulties to document them because, you know, people appear, fortunately, within a certain term. You don't even have time to report it internally, but internationally either. This is also a challenge for us, international mechanisms that have not instrumentalized mechanisms for whenever we have short-term enforced disappearances so that we can send help immediately. We need to continue thinking about that. But we cannot deny the linking of what is happening, the decrease of democracy and the increase of disappearances. And finally, I've got to say this at the beginning, the work group is also drafting reports and general comments. The most recent one was on enforced disappearances in the context of elections. I recommend you read that. And I'm currently leading enforced disappearances in the context of territory defenses, environment, and the date is almost here, but I would love to get your contributions. Thank you very much.
Porque como las personas aparecen, afortunadamente, dentro de un plazo, no dan tiempo ni siquiera de reportarse ni a nivel interno, pero tampoco a nivel internacional, ¿eh? Este es un reto también para nosotros, mecanismos internacionales, que no hemos tampoco instrumentalizado mecanismos expeditos para cuando hay una desaparición forzada llamada a corta duración, que podamos enviar inmediatamente las medidas. Nos toca seguir pensando en eso, ¿no? Pero ahí también decir que no podemos negar, vincular lo que está pasando con la pérdida de la democracia, con las violaciones a derechos humanos y el aumento de las desapariciones. Finalmente decir, que se me olvidó decir en la primera parte, El grupo de trabajo también hace informes y comentarios generales. El último fue sobre desaparición forzada en contexto de elecciones. Se los recomiendo mucho.
Thank you so much.
Actualmente
And
estoy
I will now
liderando, yo me
ask
tocó liderar a
the
mí,
last colleague
desapariciones
in
forzadas
the
en contexto de
round
defensa de
of
tierra,
reactions.
recursos naturales y medio
Morris,
ambiente.
please.
Apúrense que ya casi se
Needs
cierra la fecha, pero
no
me daría mucho
introduction.
gusto que
Morris
nos pudieran enviar
Stibbins, but he's
contribuciones.
special
Gracias.
rapporteur on extrajudicial summary and arbitrary executions of
Thank
the
you so much.
UN
No,
and
very
has
quickly, I just wanted to
huge and
mention
vast
that,
experience on this.
I'm
So
ready to share
Morris,
some
you have
figures
5
that
minutes,
just say
please.
that for those interventions that cannot take place under the humanitarian procedure, where it's not possible to have reaction from the
Thank you
stakeholders
very
that are
much,
seeking
Wilder. I'd
fixes,
like to
again,
start
with the analysis
thanking
of risk
and
analysis made by the
congratulating
families themselves,
the
by the victims themselves on the ground, if they feel that the
group of
intervention
work
of
and
working groups
also
through a
the
joint
committee.
communication or even a
Thank you very
public
much for
statement
your
about such a
work.
situation would
You've
help
been
improve some
very
advocacy,
humble
at least,
and very diplomatic
internally, then that's all
when
good
you
news enough
describe
to
the
be followed. And
titanic
in the
work
case
that you do
specifically of Syria, there has
with
been 25
so
years
few
of implementation by the
resources.
working group since 2011. In the case
Congratulations,
of the
and
Ukraine, there has been about 7 since the beginning of the
my
war. So other avenues
biggest
seem to be
gratitude.
Thank you.
Muchas
There are
gracias.
two mechanisms that
Bueno, y ahora le voy a pedir
face
al último
the
colega
issues
en la
that
ronda
we are
de
dealing with.
reacciones, a Morris
In many cases,
Stibbins.
the disappeared
Morris no necesita
people,
presentación, pero es
we usually find
especial
them
con
deaf
estas
and not
desapariciones
alive.
sumarias y arbitrarias de Naciones
And this
Unidas.
has to do
Tenga
with the
independencia
summary
en esta materia.
extrajudiciary
Morris, tiene 5 minutos.
executions, which is my mandate.
Muchas gracias, Wilder.
Coming back to the title of this workshop,
Quiero empezar
connect or to
por
reconnect
agradecer y
with
felicitar al
victims,
grupo de trabajo y al
together with
comité por la
mechanisms,
labor que realizan.
UN mechanisms.
Y creo que han sido muy
Let me tell
humildes
you
y
that
diplomáticos
in reality, there is nothing to
en describir
connect.
la tarea titánica que
Thus, mechanisms
realizan
are
con
the
recursos
result
realmente muy limitados. Así
of
que
victims,
la verdad, mis
battles,
sinceras
fights,
felicitaciones y
family member
mi
fights,
mandato
and
no es una
organized civil
desapariciones.
society.
Afortunadamente hay dos mecanismos
Everything has been
que
always
nos son
connected. Of course, we
dedicados,
must
pero
face new
obviamente y
challenges,
desafortunadamente,
calling for
aunque buscamos a todos y a las
improvements of
desaparecidas con
communication
vida,
channels.
en muchos
With
casos
this regard,
no los
echoing
encontramos
what
vivos, sino
Michael
que
Chamberlain
fallecidos y
mentioned
obviamente
in an
corresponden en ese
informal
caso
meeting
a mi
with
mandato
relatives
sobre
yesterday,
ejecuciones
when he
extrajudiciales
said that we
sumarias
need to
o
change the
arbitrarias.
paradigm.
Yo voy a digregar
I
un
think that
poco
it is
y volviendo un poco
important
al
to say
título de
that the 40 years of the
taller,
mandate, the first mandate, the special and unipersonal
reconectar
proceeding
a
created by the
las
Commission of
víctimas
Human
con
Rights after the
los
creation
mecanismos
of the working group
de Naciones
for
Unidas
forced and involuntary disparitions
y
in
decir que en
1980.
realidad
It was another period of time, another period of history.
reconectar, porque
Very few
estos
special
mecanismos son el
proceedings by the
producto
time, the
del
communication
resultado de la
that
lucha de las
stemmed from our
víctimas, de
work
los familiares
many
y de
times
la
was the
sociedad
only
civil
voice that was
organizada.
listened, and it did have an
Siempre han estado
authority and a
conectados.
very
Obviamente hay nuevos
important role to
desafíos
play. And unfortunately,
que llaman a mejorar los canales de
not
comunicación.
enough today.
Y
Suddenly, we
en
did
ese
have the Minnesota
sentido,
Protocol
haciéndole un
and
poco eco a lo
very
que mencionaba
many
el
other
compañero Michael Chamberlain en
valuable
una reunión
tools,
informal con
very
familiares
valuable
ayer,
tools
de que hay que
and
pensar en
instruments
algunos cambios
that
de paradigma.
allowed us to investigate,
Se me ocurrió importante
to bring
destacar
people to
que
trials, and
en los
now
40 años que tiene
we
el
are
mandato,
living
fue el primer
a
mandato de
different
procedimiento especial
era.
unipersonal creado por
We can know
la Comisión de
immediately what
Derechos
happens in
Humanos,
Syria, in
después de haber
Sudan, in
creado el grupo de
Uruguay, and in
trabajo
many
sobre
other places as well.
sobre desapariciones
There is
forzadas
such an
involuntarias en
array
el año
of different
1980.
NGOs and civil
Era
society
otra época.
organizations, as well as
Eran muy pocos
family
los
sources all over the
procedimientos
world,
especiales.
doing a great job
La
when documenting
comunicación
the human
que
rights
surgía
violations.
de nuestra labor
We have
era a veces la
loads
única
of
voz que
legal
se
and
oía. Y tenía obviamente un
instruments
peso y
and
una autoridad
mechanisms. I'm a
que
forensic
hoy
doctor and can
desgraciadamente
tell
ya
you
en muchos
that there
casos
has been a
no
revolution
se
in the
tiene.
last
Luego vino
40
otra
years in my
época
field.
que fue la del
This morning
desarrollo
was
de
mentioned the role
instrumentos y de
that
herramientas como el
the
protocolo de
DNA
Minnesota
assessment and
y
analysis
muchas
will help
otras
us to identify disappeared
valiosísimas
people. But there also, we can see an erosion of the international system and how the complaints against human rights crimes are vandalized. The impact of our work is not the same that we had 40 years ago. And this is a reality, a painful reality that we must accept. However, I do believe that our mechanisms, and we count with 60 special proceedings nowadays, when we say that there are very few resources, I think that more than ever we do have resources, but we can see that more than ever we do have more special proceedings, and we still have the same problems that back in the day Animus Hueco had in the past. He was the first rapporteur. He also complained about this lack of resources by that time. We can see that there is a huge potential, something that we cannot explore in our mechanisms, and it has to do with the experience that we can give, that we can get as experts in the field. Beyond the communications, the origin communications that we prepare, the informal communications, the thematic reports, and the country visits as well. But let's use our strengths as we did in Mexico, Argentina, and the Philippines, where the civil society organizations and families associations invited us to share the practical experiences, to know how to investigate an extrajudiciary execution, how to bring the responsible to declare what he did, and how to compensate the victims' suffering. Of course, we go back to this lack of resources, but resources can be found. I'd like to thank the NGOs, the civil society organizations that funded some of these missions in the field to give an answer to these needs. Finally, I do think that maybe due to such an array and variety of communication and instruments that we have, we or probably me personally in my mind, we are not getting so much claims. For specific contexts, we do get many claims, and for other contexts, we are not getting enough claims. Therefore, we do need a reconnection with civil society to improve. Also, the level of quality of communications. Let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, me, myself, as a forensic doctor, as a humanist, as a human that fights for human rights, together with the majority of communications that we are getting won't get an okay in a report in international amnesty. This makes the task very difficult to all the rapporteurs. We will be delighted to have workshops in the field together with the different actors to improve the communication. Please bear with us, take advantage of us, and thank you very much for your support. Thank you very much, Maurice, as usual. Very interesting contribution. And finally, this call that you did, this is a call for attention that's always very useful to all of us. Thank you very much for your efforts. Thank you very much to all the members of the panel of this part. We do have a second part in this seminar. It's going to be shorter, but it's going to be very intense as well. Please, I'll ask to some of you to come back, but I'd like to call three colleagues to come to the stage next to me. Please, Juan Carlos Gutiérrez Contreras from Mexico, Maximiliano Mook from Mexico as well, and María Isabel Cruz Bernal.
Y eso nos dificulta la tarea a los relatores y a las relatoras. Así que para eso también estaríamos encantados de justamente hacer talleres en el terreno para mejorar esas comunicaciones. Úsennos, estamos a la orden y muchísimas gracias por el apoyo de siempre.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Morris. Como siempre, una intervención tan interesante. Además, ese último llamado de atención que nos viene bien a todos. Así que muchísimas gracias por esta. Y muchísimas gracias a todos.
We're looking for María Isabel. We're looking for her. She's one of the members of our organization. While we look for her, we're going to start our debate together with Juan Carlos Gutiérrez Contreras, legal coordinator at IDHEAS organization. He's going to talk about the urgent actions that have been presented in front of the committee. You have 5 minutes. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to greet the family members, the members that are at the center of our activity. And I'd like to recall someone that should be here, but was a victim of a forced disparition 2 years ago. I'm talking about Ricardo Lagunes, a lawyer that fought for the territories, and he was declared disappeared in Michoacan state in Mexico. There is an urgent action from the UN in his favor, calling to look for him and to work for the research and to look for him to investigate where's the situation of Ricardo. The role that we had in Mexico when having internal litigations inside the country, what we did in Mexico to guarantee the action that are urgent inside the role that the committee plays. The urgent actions have been vital mechanisms. It's an humanitarian mechanism that belongs to the Article 30 in the convention that allowed the committee to find disappeared people. More than 450 individuals were localized thanks to the urgent actions that were implemented. Iraq and Mexico today, they have the biggest amount of forced disparitions that counted with urgent actions. However, in Mexico, we tried from the litigation strategy to create new strategies. We asked to the attorney mayors in Mexico and the prosecutors to recognize that is something binding. And the prosecutor said that no, the urgent actions do not belong to the treaty of the convention. With this regard, we use a legal resource that is the protection. Once we open a discussion with the legal powers in Mexico, we can reach to the Supreme Court in Mexico. Finally, the Supreme Court of Justice in Mexico, after an historical decision, said that the urgent actions of the UN are compulsory and mandatory and binding for all Mexican authorities, which is an amazing and quite impressive new situation. It's a great example for activist lawyers to use it and to ask the courts and to all legal proceedings to have a say about the mandatory respect of this strategy. And after the Vienna Convention and respecting the treaties, we cannot get rid of the Convention of disparitions and to take out the search instrument. This is the goal of the Convention, to look for people, disappeared people. It is important to be aware about. We do have a communication together with the UN office, and that's something that you can read in line. I cannot have a summary of 5 years of litigations in just 5 minutes. However, what Professor Allen said, in Mexico, we counted with the support of the Human Rights Committee because we didn't ratify the competences of the committee against these forced disparitions due to the problem that we have in the convention, because we cannot get petitions before the ratification of this convention. This is something that organizations had to overcome. We went in front of the committee and said that there are forced disparitions, and these forced disparitions are violating the international role that political rights can play. We went from IDHEAS to CEDAW. The CEDAW has the first case of forced disparition of women, and CEDAW pronounced that the forced disparitions are a violent measure, extreme violent measure against women. Once a woman is a victim of disparition, CEDAW said that we are vulnerating all the structure of the convention against forced disparitions and the structure and also the architecture fighting against women disparitions. So we are working in this sense to protect the health of mothers that have been saved. We are looking about it, and we presented in front of the Committee of Cultural and Economic Rights this report asking to the committee to offer a public policy for health and care in Mexico. So the challenge from civil society, it is to open this issue and to position in different places as well as in the different bodies and mechanisms for this issue not to disappear in the UN agenda. I'd like to conclude just mentioning that the work made by the committee was vital. The first case against Mexico, the first claim against Mexico, Jonathan Berrospe case, let me tell you that there is a lack of efficiency, is that we don't have the ability to comply with decisions. This is something that I was saying to Professor Ale. The mechanism of the committee does not allow attorneys to pressure and to ask the state to comply with the resolutions and the sentences, because sometimes we don't have an efficient mechanism to make states to comply with the sentences. I think that thanks to the Supreme Court of Justice in Mexico, the urgent actions as included are always in favor of what we are trying to implement, thanks also to the role of the Inter-American Court of Justice that said that these dispositions are binding and compulsory and mandatory. We progressed a lot from the litigation perspective in Mexico. However, we still have 120,000 cases of disappeared people. The Inter-American system is taking more than 15 years to claim about the disappearance case. Therefore, we do need the UN instruments to be more active. And we can see that they are more active than the Mexican ones. For the Alban case, we took 3 years only, since the beginning up to the final resolution. So, we do believe that this is a great progress. If we compare the access to justice of an inter-American organ that takes 15 years and a case that only takes 3 years in the UN system, in the committee system, which is much more efficient and quicker and faster. The Human Rights Committee took only 5 years. Let me ask you for something. This is my proposal. I think that the organizations here in this room, we do need to write or to approve a charter for the High Commissioner of the UN, asking to have more resources to better follow up and to better decide and to allocate more resources to the committee and the organizations fighting for forced disappearances, a charter that will offer some resources to strengthen these organs and organizations. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Juan Carlos. Thank you so much for your contribution. We'd like to welcome Maria Isabel. Thank you very much for being with us today. How do you prefer to proceed? All right. So now we'll give the floor to Maximiliano. You can correct me. He's the coordinator of human identification. You have 5 minutes. He needs to turn on the mic. Okay. We are together with Maria to show some cases in Sinaloa. Also together with the role of UN, we'd like to greet all the families here with us, looking for the beloved, and the fight that we can witness in Mexico and in many other countries, thanks to the commitment of civil society and also the family members. The Mexican case is an example to follow. One of the recommendations of the Committee Against Forced Disappearances as it was mentioned before today, Mexico reports officially more than 120,000 disappeared people. And simultaneously, thanks to the work of the civil society and the families, we do know that there are around 72,000 people without being identified in the social services. So as a forensic, I can conclude that many of the people that are disappeared probably are dead or passed away. So November 2021, the committee made a visit to the country invited by the government, and this visit finalized with a series of recommendations dealing with the prevention, eradication of mass disappearance, and also research, and also in a very brief way, improving the forensic skills. Also, we emphasize the importance of identification technologies through digital prints in common graves. In many contexts, it is true that genetics is important, that's safer and cheaper to identify people in different contexts. As a response to this recommendation, the Common Graves and the Institute for Search in Mexico, together with the support of the governments of Mexico, the Agency for Population and Development of the UN, also the identity management, we began a program for human identification by the end of 2022. The main goal was to give support to the implementation of the digital prints, program of digital prints to better identify the disappeared people. We took well note of the intervention today of the Mexican ambassador that communicated that is going to be implemented a national policy of human identification, which this is something that really lacks. This is a multidisciplinary event. So in a very specific way, in a very concrete way, before the beginning of the program, the official and public data in Mexico showed that only 3 over the 32 forensic state services could check the digital prints of disappeared people with the biggest database that Mexico has, which is the Electoral National Registry, that includes more than 98 million Mexicans with all the digital prints. The impact has been significant. Now in 2024, I had the pleasure to talk with this organization last week. The amount of forensic services increased up to 24. In Mexico, we do have 32 states, and the comparison of the different reports and cards of 800 individuals that were not identified in 2020, reaching more than 6,000 last year in 2024, which is quite a significant increase, 600% increase. Also, the death people is around 50% more than the previous years, thanks to the national system under the coordination of the National Commission for Search. We created 300 portable scanners to all the prosecutors and forensic doctors to take the digital prints and to send the information in an electronic manner. When you travel to the US, in just 5 milliseconds, the government knows who you are, and this is something that already happens with these fingerprints that have been implemented in Mexico. So, in a nutshell, what we really want to underscore, and I'd like to give the floor right now to Maria, that she witnessed these works in Sinaloa, we can recognize that the success of the program has to do with a very precise recommendation of the committee and the commitment of the Mexican government with implementation through the National Commission for Search, the Secretary of Government, and the Prosecutor of the Republic. This is an example, a very specific example about how to implement these specific recommendations. Thank you very much, Maximiliano. Now would like to welcome María Isabel Puznan. 6 minutes. I have many things to say. Anyway, okay. Many things to say. However, I do believe that one of the most important things is to thank the ambassadors, German ambassadors. Thank you very much for the scanners that we were waiting for in Mexico. The identification for the families is vital. Not only finding the bodies of the disappeared, we are, as mothers, we are the ones that offer, we are the searchers, we are the ones that look for the bodies. It is not only the effort that we do to increase the forensic crisis that we have in the country, but also finally, thanks to UNFA that had the chance to sign this convention together with the state of Sinaloa, and the results of the families, well, we did have a conversation since the beginning. We did have, there were many doubts, a crisis. We do have a war where bodies are found in the streets. This identification system to us was very fruitful. There were many cases to identify through DNA, and sometimes we need to wait 1 year, 8 months, or maybe more. We identified the people since 2016. We do have 3 colleagues. The family members disappeared in 2018, 2021, and they were detected thanks to the fingerprint processes. Despite there is a lot to do, there is still a lot to do. All the states need to improve this, and this is something that Max mentioned. The accountability, the impunity doesn't allow us to progress. Also, the forensic crisis, as a politician mentioned before, a century was needed to put an end with this forensic crisis. We, mothers, we are passing away, and the only thing that we want is to find our treasures, to bring them back home. The efforts that you do from the office, and to observe that Mexico is doing this job, thank you very much. We want them alive.
Thank you so much for these comments and this testimony, which is something that echoes all around the region in Latin America, what you've just said. Thank you so much to the 3 of you, and now I will ask Juan Pablo and Lorena to come here, and so that we can do this last change and rotation in program.
Y lo único que queremos es encontrar a nuestro pedazo y a nuestros tesoros, como les decimos nosotros, y que sean regresados a casa. Por eso, y creo que los esfuerzos que hacen ustedes desde un escritorio y desde estar observando que México realice el trabajo, por eso y más, gracias a todos. ¡Vivo los queremos!
Bueno, muchísimas gracias entonces por este comentario y testimonio, que es común a América Latina.
This is a space for conclusions. So, are you organized on who's going to come first? We have now 6 minutes.
Finalmente a Juan Pablo y a René, si pudieran venir acá. Y hacemos el último cambio, la última rotación
Terms, and before we start talking about some closure ideas, I need to ask, because the secretary of the committee said she wanted to make a short contribution, and I think it's fair to hear from her first.
Y la parte de conclusiones, sí. Bien. Esta es una instancia de conclusiones. Entonces, yo le pregunto a los colegas si ya se han organizado sobre quién habla primero, pero si no, digo, tenemos 6 minutos y 6 minutos, no la 12.
Bueno,
adelante.
Juan Pablo, thank you very much. I believe you have 4 minutes left for your final conclusion. Well, I'll try to use the 4. Obviously, the first thing I want to say, and going back to what Morris was saying in his intervention, is that the raison d'etre of mechanisms in the end is that victims and CSOs and all the work that they do on the field. What Juan Carlos said is very descriptive as far as this interaction is concerned. When this interaction is done appropriately and with patience, it leads on to very positive results, such as the Mexican Supreme Court establishing the compulsory nature of all these aspects of the committee, but we have some limitations in our work. We now need to recognize that we are delayed in the review of the initial reports of some states, and specifically the review of complementary information under Articles 29.3 and 29.4 of the Convention, and this is related to the lack of capacity. I want to go back to what Morris was saying. Yes, the diversity of mechanisms is very rich and wealthy, and perhaps more resources now than before, but it needs to be distributed between more supervisory mechanisms, and the task at hand is more complicated. We try to do our work as efficiently as possible. The committee has recently started to perform double registries and triple registries in urgent action, notifying not only the state about a disappearance of a person, but also other states who could have an incidence in the search process. And obviously this demands a more complex follow-up, because not only you need to speak to a state, but rather you need to speak to several states. 1 year ago, approximately, we lost part of our resources to provide a follow-up because of a decision that was made in the system and is not relevant now, although I am criticizing it, but anyway. And we had a person responsible for this, and our secretary is drafting reports, needs to prepare the visits, it needs to handle all the diplomatic handling done with states. And yes, I do believe that civil society has a very relevant role in speaking up, not just to demand the search of their missing people, and this is what corresponds to civil society and families, of course, but also to demand that these mechanisms created by states be functional, because creating mechanisms just for the sake of having them as a formality, not responding to the needs of the victims, has no purpose. We better close and leave. So far, we have more or less managed to achieve and do our work, but we have concerns about the future of the compliance of our work. And as Waldo is now looking at me straight and staring, I'm going to stop here. I was looking at you very intensely because of the interest I have in what you were saying. Thank you so much. Thank you. And now you have 5 minutes to... Well, as a conclusion, we're going back to the same thing here. The role of families and victims is fundamental, and I repeat what Morris was saying. Please use us, and use us means come, approach us. You don't need to know everything. Not everything needs to be perfect, in the sense that if you know that this is going to the committee or the working group or what, or this or that procedure, all the facts need to be properly documented. That's what's essential for us. And after that, we can get organized to know whether to activate other procedures, what measures we can take. But without you, without the support of families, it is practically impossible for us to do anything. So the engine of this all are you. It is very important to continue believing that there is a coordination between the committee and the working group. You shouldn't be the ones to know who is in charge of what. We need to continue thinking about how we face situations with a large number of enforced disappearances because of armed conflict or other situations. We need to see how to tackle the ill-called short-term disappearances because we don't have effective mechanisms that allow us to react on time. We also need to think about how to document cases in armed conflict context or authoritarian context, where many times families are elsewhere, and we have not thought about how we can face a country that won't allow us in. This is something that we need to think of in the UN. Academic visits, please do invite us. It is a different way of turning things around so that countries, do not invite us to country visits, because an academic visit allows us to go to the field to deliver a conference, and this means approaching the families and those who are there. Do count us in for capacity building sessions. We have 3, but if you can't come, you can request a meeting online, and also in between sessions. The colleague from Ukraine was saying that we need more capacity building. The working group also provides capacity building between sessions. So if you're requesting an online workshop, we can do that. And that is another way of getting close. Resources are required. Of course, emergency actions continue to be the fundamental resource to search people. They are binding for the state, and we need to find all necessary ways so that they are found compulsory. Juan Carlos was saying that we're sending a letter to the High Commissioner to have resources. I would say, okay, but those providing the resources are the states. So those who we need to talk to so that the UN has funds is the states. And their organizations, once again, play a very significant role with their own states to ask them to comply with the contributions for the UN. Finally, it is not just about finding, as Maria Isabel was saying, I thought it was very important. It's not just about finding. In Mexico, we have the finders trying to search on the field. Another huge challenge related to Max's intervention is how can we get to the identification process? Many countries are thinking about the identification of remains. We need to recognize, as Maria Isabel was saying, that impunity, we need to take into account impunity. Impunity does not allow for identification, we need to think about formulas so that victims, organizations, and those experts in the UN and academicians have spaces such as this one where we can share, think together, and build. And mental health is very important as well as a dignified life of those who search. More and more moms are dying and passing away without finding their own relatives, and finally, the search must not stop. Thank you.
Por último, no es solo encontrar la intervención de María Isabel.
Well, fellow colleagues and participants, we are reaching the end.
Otro de los grandes retos que también tiene que ver con la intervención de Max es cómo vamos a llegar a la identificación.
Trend-setting conclusion remarks. I would like to thank the high quality of the interventions of all the members. We would have for an entire day or a seminar. That's the truth. I'm so sorry I had to cut the session short. Thank you for your patience and apologies for this. For this moderation I did. A big round of applause for the moderator, please. Thank you.
Importante la salud mental y la vida digna de quienes buscan. Cada vez mueren más madres sin encontrar en los suyos. Y de aquí también un reconocimiento a todas las madres buscadoras. Y por último, la búsqueda no debe parar. Gracias.